Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Ann Green. I'm on the Friends of Fondren board, and on behalf of the Association of Rice Alumni and the Friends of Fondren Library, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture with, and I'm standing right in front of him, Scott Sonenshein, PhD, author of Joy at Work and Stretch. We're delighted that you've joined us. We will begin with the discussion tonight, and then we will follow it with audience questions and answers. And then afterwards, we'll move down the hall to the Brown Fine Arts Library for a reception. Friends of Fondren is delighted to present tonight's event with the Association of Rice Alumni. If you'd like to support events like this by joining our library membership program, please visit library@rice.edu or pick up a membership form over on the registration table. I'm delighted to introduce you to Scott Sonenshein. Dr. Sonenshein is the Henry Gardiner Symonds Professor of Management at Rice University and a New York Times best-selling author whose books have been translated into over 20 languages. He holds a PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Michigan, a master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, and a BA from the University of Virginia. His research appears in the top academic journals and has contributed to several topics in management and psychology, including organizational change, resourcefulness, resiliency, creativity, and social issues. Scott is a former associate editor of his field's top publication, the Academy of Management Journal. He's written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, Fast Company, and Harvard Business Review. He's also been interviewed on national and local TV, NPR stations throughout the country, and has been featured in most major newspapers. Tonight, he will be interviewed by Nicholas Castellanos, director of the Business Information Center in the Jones Graduate School of Business. Mr. Castellanos has been in this role for 2 years, previously serving as Associate Director of Texas Southern University's Library Learning Center and Assistant Professor and Public Services Librarian at the University of St. Thomas. So please join me in welcoming both Dr. Sonenshein and Mr. Castellanos.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today. And we've prepared some questions to encourage conversation about your many writings. And again, thank you for joining us. In your first book, Stretch, you teach us to rethink what we need to succeed and to do more with what we already have. Can you share what inspired you to write this book?
So a lot of my research has been on this area of resourcefulness, which is essentially how do you take the resources around you, time, money, connections, concepts, almost anything, and how do you get the most out of it? And before I was an academic, I worked in Silicon Valley during the rise and the subsequent collapse of the dot-com era. And that largely inspired my research on both resourcefulness and organizational change. I had moved to Silicon Valley almost on a whim. I got it was like kind of crazy times. I got like a phone call from a recruiter for a job I was completely unqualified for, saying, just kind of fly across the country and come to this high-flying startup that was, backed by many of the most prestigious venture capitalist firms in the country, namely Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia. And so I got out there, and it was kind of a euphoric setting for someone in their early 20s, a really fun environment because it was just full of excess in every possible way. And so anyway, I didn't know anyone out there, and I decided 3 weeks later I was taking the job, and I had moved across the country not knowing a single person. And I got there, and it didn't take too long for me to connect the dots that this thing was basically a house of cards. It was completely dependent on having more and more resources put into the business. It was almost like this magical formula. Like, we would raise money. It would be how quickly can we spend the money, and then magically someone would give us more money, and the value of the company would go up. And people believe like that was the formula to success. It's like just try and suck in as many resources as possible, and that's how you're going to grow, and that's how the enterprise is going to have more value. Of course, that only works when people are willing to write you blank checks. And as the tech market started to collapse, our organization was basically exposed for what it was, which was an unsustainable company with no semblance of any business model. And so, I went from, we're hiring tons of people every week to, how quickly can we lay off people? And that was a really psychologically difficult experience to go through, because you build connections and relationships with people, and it was tough. And as I kind of was reflecting on those moments, and I saw really bad change management practices, that's kind of when I started developing my ideas of, how can we go from how can we consume as many resources to might there be ways of making the most out of the resources that we have? How can we focus on practices of change management that can lead to better outcomes? I mean, we had the opportunity to weather the storm, but we had really bad change management practices. So kind of that experience, I think, largely inspired my research, which is a precursor to writing my first book, Stretch, which is basically on the science of resourcefulness.
Thank you. And thinking about how would we stretch? I know you have that in the book, but please explain to some of the tactics and measures.
Part of the premise of the book is, when we hear the word constraints, we tend to think of limitations. We tend to think of obstacles to achieving the goals that we care most about. And part of the book is to convince us, both through scientific studies as well as illustrations and examples, that actually constraints are very liberating. And this is a little counterintuitive, I think, for some people to get. But what the research teaches us is, when we have constraints, so less than we think we need, whether it be time or money or people around or expertise or knowledge, what it does is it frees us to think about the things that we do have in non-conventional ways. So the reality is we are all born resourceful. We all come into this world being able to take things around us and do more with less. And there's actually a kind of simple illustration of this. I like to call it the frying pan test. So you give a frying pan to a child who has not been socialized through our institutions like education, work organizations, and what do they do with it? Maybe they use it as a bathtub for some toys. Maybe they use it as a step stool to be able to reach the cookie jar. Maybe on a really bad day, they use it as a weapon to whack their sibling with. But you give it to someone, an adult who has been socialized, and they only see it as an instrument that you cook with. And so the idea of stretching is that when we impose constraints on us, we free ourselves from the conventions of how we typically use resources. And when we free ourselves from those conventions, we allow for the possibility of discovery of new uses of things, whether it be solving a simple problem in our personal lives to how we might rethink something as large as a business strategy.
Thank you. And what are some other implications of not stretching at work and in society?
Well, I contrast stretching with what I call chasing. And I think chasing is something that's been a problem in our society that's been exacerbated by social media. Chasing is this belief that in order to do more, you need more resources. So let's say you're at work professionally. If you want to be able to accomplish a goal, it's as simple as, I just need more time, I need more budget, I need more people on my team. Chasing is fueled by social comparisons. And social comparisons are essentially the idea that we look to other people and what other people have and think that we need those same resources in order to achieve success. So there's this cliche that I'm sure you've all heard of, that the grass is always greener on the other side. There's a really interesting study that looks at the way that we view our neighbor's fence, our neighbor's grass when we're looking over the fence. And the idea of this study is essentially the angle of the refraction of the light shows that the neighbor's grass is actually appears greener. But the reality is it's just as lush as our grass. It's only the way that we're looking at it. And if we generalize that to how we think about the resources in our personal and professional lives, we often get selective information when we're looking at other people, their careers, other organizations, and what they have. And because we have these jaded views of what they have and what they're doing with what they have, we tend to think that we need more. So we almost end up on this, think of it like a treadmill, that we feel like if we want to increase our performance or increase our life satisfaction, we need more things to do that. My argument is what we need to do is not worry about what's in someone else's hand, but to kind of do more with what's already in hand.
And when you were in Silicon Valley and you saw some of the behavior of chasing, were there any corrections that you may have suggested to any team members or companies?
I mean, I wish I had that wisdom, but I didn't really have that wisdom. I think it was. I'm amazed that I was able to kind of see the problem, because you get caught up in these chases, and on some level, it's very exhilarating in the moment to be thinking, we're going to be growing this thing very fast. We're going to be, hiring all these people. Like, there's a sense of excitement that comes with it until you hit rock bottom and the whole thing crashes down, because you've been so focused on acquiring more resources that you haven't figured out what are you going to do with them. And that's a problem not just in our professional lives. It's a problem too in our personal lives.
Thank you. Excuse me. And in your second book, Joy at Work, I really enjoyed that book. You wrote that book with Marie Kondo. How was it that you partnered with her?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I should start by saying this is a really interesting challenge, one to, I think, write a book with someone else, especially who doesn't speak the same language as you. So that was kind of the foundation of our relationship, is we would always have to communicate with a translator. But Marie had read the Japanese version of Stretch and kind of resonated with the message, and just invited me to her house. She was living in San Francisco at the time, to understand what science would say about her method of tidying. So that was kind of the guise under which I met her, and kind of true to like what you might expect, she invites me to her immaculate home, and we sit at her dining room table, and we have tea, and we just talked. And what was supposed to be about an hour meeting, turned into about a 4-hour meeting, and we kind of just hit it off, even though we really couldn't understand each other directly. And at the end, we just said, maybe we just write a book about work together. And that's really how it started. And we started exchanging emails with some ideas after that.
That's a charming story.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining your connection and your meeting. And how did you and Marie combine your philosophies on organization?
So it's kind of funny, because before I even started partnering with Marie on this book, it's like, you're sitting on the airplane, and someone's asking, what do you do? And I'm like, well, I'm an organizational psychologist. And they either look at you with like, what the hell is that? Or they say, oh, that's really neat. Can you help organize my closet? And so I was offended by some of them. Like, no, I'm like, I have a PhD basically in psychology. I'm like, I can't teach you how to do the closet. And then of course, look at me now. I wrote a book with someone who has but the way I like to think about the way we combined our ideas is Marie is really good at teaching us to hold on to the things that bring us the most joy, that spark joy. My contribution is around, once you have kind of a more curated set of things around you, how do you solve problems, whether they be in your personal life or in your professional life? So she helps us kind of clean out a lot of messes, literally and metaphorically, and I help figure out how to solve problems with the limited things that you have left.
Can you please explain some of the tests you developed and the 3-part test you developed on what to keep?
Yeah, so we had to think. Marie, for those of you who are familiar with her first book, has this thing where her main thing, you really have to focus on what is it that you're choosing to keep, and you focus on what sparks joy. And I think it was pretty early in our discussions. I'm like, well, that's not going to work at work. I mean, you can't just go up to your boss and go like, you don't spark joy, you're out of here. Like, that's just not. So we needed to think about work a little differently. I mean, I know it looks like a number of you would actually like to do that, but but it's just not so practical. So we developed a 3-part test that you should try and hold on to things that spark joy at work. So that's one of the 3 tests. But you should also ask yourselves, are there just certain things that are essential and necessary for my job? And the reality is that if most people do an audit of how they spend their time, they were going to come to the realization that there's a lot of clutter, metaphorically clutter, in their days. Things that they do, the report that they do that no one reads, or the email message that no one wants to hear from, that they do largely because they're insecure and they have anxiety over not being heard or wanting to feel important. And so we start to clutter our schedules with activities that don't make a difference in our own careers, and they also don't make a difference in the impact of other people's work. But we do them because we've always done them, or we feel like they're important for us to be visible. So the first part is really to go through and do an audit of how you spend your time and asking, is this really essential? Is this having an impact on either myself or someone else at work? The second part of the test is to then ask, okay, is this something that will bring me joy in the future? So you might not want to go to, let's say, a training session that will teach you some new skills, but might it be important to bring joy in the future? So maybe it sets you up for a promotion because you've learned a new set of skills that makes you more marketable. And then third is it just intrinsically joyful? And the idea is, if you ask this question about everything that you do, and you can't say yes to one of those 3 criteria, it's either intrinsically joyful, it brings you future joy, or it's absolutely necessary, you should not hold on to it, and you should do your best to drop it.
And thank you. In thinking about what to keep, is this only applied to physical spaces?
No, so it's not just physical spaces. That's the thing about work, is that we can think about how we spend our time. We can think about our networks, and is it really that helpful to just have tons of connections? I mean, the neuroscience says we can at most have about 150 meaningful connections in life. So why do people grow their networks so much? We can think about our calendars. We can think about meetings. I mean, people have meetings in increments of usually 30 or 60 minutes, which to me seems like a really arbitrary number. I mean, maybe it only takes 22 minutes. Why do we need to round up and waste people's 8 minutes? So, or why do we need to have a meeting if there's no agenda and there's nothing that we need to discuss? We don't need to have a meeting just because it's the Tuesday meeting, and that's what we do on Tuesday at 9 a.m. So there's a sense of being more mindful of how we are spending our days at work that go beyond just thinking about what's on our desk. We think about what's on our calendars, what's in our networks, what's happening at our meetings.
Thank you. And, excuse me. You've worked here since 2007. Why did you decide to write books to general audiences, like The Joy at Work?
So I guess a couple of things. So I should point out that most of my research comes from ethnographic methods. I spend a lot of time in the field observing people, studying them, sometimes participating. So there's always been a part of me that wanted to vicariously experience different professions, because the type of job I have today, as wonderful it is the same type of job I had in 2007. There's not much different about what it's like to be a faculty member at the beginning of your career and at the end of the career. Most of your day is occupied by the same types of activities. And as rewarding and as meaningful and as fortunate as I am to do all of that, it gets a little boring sometimes. And so when I do my field research, part of what I really like about it is kind of going and trying out different types of content context and environment. So I've been doing a lot of work in performing arts recently with the symphony and with some theater companies. I've studied food trucks, I've studied environmentalists. So these are kind of all the things like my alternative selves of like, if I didn't become an academic, like what kind of career might I have? And so it's kind of nice that I can do that. Writing a book was like another one of these things where it's like what we would call like task variety. It's like a new set of tasks. And so I wanted to try a different type of intellectual puzzle. And I also wanted to have a different type of impact. So, those of you, or some of you might not be familiar, is like you can spend 5 years writing an academic article that you keep your fingers crossed that gets accepted into a good place, that you hope might be cited a couple of hundred times, and you hope that a small portion of those people actually read the article and aren't just ceremoniously citing it. So, part of this was, taking this research that I've been doing and working so hard on and trying to bring it to a wider audience so it can make hopefully some type of impact on their lives.
Excuse me. Well, thank you for my questions here. Things like this conversation. And now we have our audience participation. Does anyone have questions? And also we'll walk around, thank you, Mary, with the microphone.
Thank you. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm trying to follow your method.
Yes.
So my first one is, I was very active during my prior career in women's issues. And I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, not as an academic, but as a professional, on why women were not getting ahead the way that it seemed they should. And one of the things that came up over and over again was that women think they can sit at their desk and work hard and they will be rewarded. And men go out and stand by the water cooler and make networks and then get ahead. And I started talking about the male conference room, which was, of course, was the bathroom, where it turned out that several of my colleagues had met somebody very important higher up the hierarchy and formed a connection in the men's bathroom. So I wondered if you have you done research or any thoughts about why it seems that women just can't advance in the same way in a hierarchy that men do?
Yeah, it's been a very sticky problem. I mean, one of the things we've seen is, more women have entered the workforce and more women are getting, in college right now than men. So kind of the foundations of change are hopefully, being laid right now, but I recognize that it's, not enough progress and not fast enough. Part of the problem, I think, is exactly what you identified. We would call it like homophily, where you end up with groups clustering around similar type of people. And if those similar types of people are in power, they're going to develop these informal connections that give them access to that power, and you basically recreate the social structure that exists today. And that's the problem. So I think you're seeing a lot more volitional outreach on part of companies to cater to trying to advance women, which I think is a good start, but I'm not necessarily sure it's solving the problem. I think a lot of things have also been reshuffled after the pandemic and remote work, and there's one camp that thinks that flexible hybrid type work is helpful for women, especially because they bear most of the child rearing responsibilities, not rightly, but that's just the way reality seems to be playing out. But there's other research that shows that people are getting promoted more when they're actually in person. And so that's a big a structural disadvantage to women. So I'm not even sure that this flexibility, which on the surface seems like it should be beneficial to women, is actually beneficial. I think there's some movement in Congress right now about universal child care that I think is absolutely important to set women up for a foundation of more success. So I certainly think that would be an important step so that women have the same opportunities as men do. But the reality is I don't think we're going to start to see large-scale change until we start to see more women in power. And that's certainly like trending in that direction, but it's really slow progress, and I share your same frustrations about that.
I'll keep going unless somebody wants to raise their hand. Let me just ask one follow-up to that. You mentioned that companies have been trying to promote diversity, but it seems like right now diversity is a dirty word. Thank you for that. Can you tell us what your opinion is on efforts to promote diversity, inclusivity, and so forth in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, the DE&I movement has, certainly been politicized in the last year, especially in the state of Texas, and that's unfortunate that's happened. That said, most employers in this country are private sector employers that are able to advance these policies, hopefully without interference of government, although it certainly seems like some state governments are trying pretty hard to shut this down. But we are seeing more kind of systematic outreach efforts around diversity, and I think time will tell if these are simply ceremonial or if they're going to have a meaningful impact. I don't think we have enough data yet. Not enough time has gone by to really see if these things are working. So I think that's to be continued.
So I work with a nonprofit organization, so we certainly know about resource constraints, but we also have a number of programs, and we've gone through some organizational, strategic planning. We define our mission, we have our, specific program areas, and then you have the individuals, and we're all, stretched probably across 2 or 3 jobs, because that's how it works when you don't have the numbers. And I do agree, it's led to some interesting innovations, but when you describe sort of is it necessary? Does it bring you joy? How do you reconcile sort of your organizational decisions versus your individual decisions? Because I think everyone on our staff has their pet project, but we also all need to be aligned and swimming the same direction as an organization trying to achieve our mission. And I think, speaking to the board that might have some views, to our management, to the individual program people, like everyone fits in a different area, and how do they all reconcile together with that concept?
Yeah, so ideally when you put this in the context of a larger social system like a work organization, you need to be thinking about the interconnectedness of your work. And that's when you think about, you might not enjoy intrinsically doing this report, but is there some beneficiary of that report? So we have in the book what's called the beneficiary test, which is essentially asking yourself, is this type of work you're doing having an impact on someone? And if it is, that could be a reason to keep it because of the joy that it brings in the future in terms of the recognition or fulfilling a basic need that someone in the organization has. So that's part of the answer, is to recognize the interconnectivity. The other part of your question, though, I think is, if you said, people might have a pet project. Pet project to me almost sounds like a red flag. Like, are you just holding on to this program because that's what you think your entire worth in this organization is about? Because this is the program that your career is anchored to. This is the program that you've spent your whole career doing, and you're kind of almost operating like a little kingdom around this program. That's when I think you need to start having honest conversations with yourself and asking, why is it that you're holding on to it? Is it really sparking intrinsic joy? Probably not. Is it necessary? Sounds like it might not be. And is it bringing future joy? If it's just kind of existing without any purpose, probably not. And so part of this is to have everyone in the organization go through this process and have honest dialogues about what really is worth keeping. Otherwise, you're going to continue to operate in these little mini kingdoms where everyone is just basically trying to chase, if I can kind of combine books now, everyone is basically just trying to chase and gather resources for their pet projects. No one's working in harmony.
Hi, so in your talk you briefly mentioned task variety. Do you think there are any advantages to it, and is it an individual choice or is it an individual need? Could you talk a bit more about it?
So task variety is about doing different types of things. And what the psych research tells us is that that's one of the criteria for doing meaningful work. Now, different people have different needs around how much it's called a growth need mindset, like how much they value of that. Most, for example, most of our MBA students, for example, would be pretty high on that variable and would want the task variety, but it's certainly not universal. It's seen as an individual difference.
Professor, good to see you again. I want to consider this possibility. Imagine a big organization and you're playing a medium kind of role. How do you encourage people around you that you don't have really the impact, like they don't report to you, per se? How do you encourage these people to give up the resources or give up the chase for resources and actually become scrappy and stretch?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts of that question. The first part is, how do you get other people to act stretchy at work, and then the kind of caveat is, especially when you don't have a reporting relationship with them or any power. And I would say role modeling is a great way to handle that. If they can kind of see the impact that stretching is having on your work and on your satisfaction, then that could be an inspiration to other people to do the same. I think part of this is, like, I was giving a talk at Google, and back then when working in offices was still kind of a thing, it was like the ceiling tile test. Like, how many ceiling tiles are over my office or in my workspace, and that's a marker of status. I think that's really unhealthy, and I think you got to start breaking that cycle somewhere. And so the idea is be an inspiration to someone and show them that you can have success both professionally and satisfaction personally by adopting this type of mindset. And my hope would be that that's all it would take to get people to kind of come on board.
If I can follow up, that sounds good, but normally we cannot do the work by ourselves. We depend on other people. And if those people are sitting in this, well, I don't have money to do that, so I'm not doing it, or I don't have paper to do that, so I'm not pushing it, right? If you depend or you work with people like that, even laterally, not necessarily vertically, how do you do that? Just being inspiration sometimes is not enough.
Right, and so then the question you want to ask yourself is, how can I get this work done with fewer people now, because I don't have them on board? And that might spark some additional creativity and ideas, among you, where you can come up with solutions to be able to do that. Maybe that prompts you to rethink and re-engineer how you would even think about this practice that used to be dependent on these people. Maybe you can re-engineer that process and come up with something differently. And it's only by putting yourself in that position of constraints that you're able to see a new way of doing things. Because the way that you're approaching the question to begin with is, how do I get the old system to work with people who are resistant to coming along? Well, maybe the question you need to be asking is, how do I reinvent the system in the first place?
When you were doing your research about doing more with the same resources, did you come across anything that there was a move in the 1990s that was called intellectual capital mapping? And some of the organizations were starting to move down that road, but it also became a very large process issue because the technology wasn't there. I wonder if you heard anything about that or have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I don't have any thoughts on that. I'm sorry.
Hi, thanks. This is Seth Street. I've been thinking a lot about organizations lately. Just both some stuff going on in our church and also at our school. I'm a teacher. I guess my question at the moment is, have you run into kind of a threshold for stretchiness? Thinking about an exercise I did where I looked at how many hours I'd worked overtime, and I went back and looked at my schedule and said, okay, where am I falling short? What can I get done more? And I concluded that, no, there's a reason why I'm working overtime. There's just not enough time to do everything that I want to do well. And so I feel like I'm running into like stretch fatigue. I don't know, maybe not quite burnout yet, but for an organization, a nonprofit or otherwise, is there like a percentage where you'd say, hey, it's good to be stretched this much, but when you get to this point, this is a red flag?
Yeah, no, it's an important question, especially in the environment that we're in right now, where burnout is a problem. and there's all kinds of research on not just the lack of satisfaction that people might have when they burn out, but it has serious health consequences for people in terms of adverse health conditions. So it's definitely a problem. And there's a chapter in Stretch called overstretching. So just like how you can over-exercise, you can overstretch. And this was very real to me when I was touring the book when it first came out, and this was right around the beginning of the Trump administration, and I was giving a talk at the IRS. And so I got an earful about this question because they were under severe funding constraints at the beginning of his administration. And what I recommend is stretching is not about how do you extract more labor out of a workforce that's already kind of on the brink of having enough. It's really about a mindset of how you rethink what it is you're doing that will hopefully preserve resources and save time. And that's why I like to think of this as not how do you do more with less, how do you do more with what you have. So that's kind of the first answer, is that if you kind of reorient the way that you work, and even like now combining the joy at work part of what I've been doing and you get rid of a lot of the clutter in your days, the idea is that you focus on the things that are gonna be the most impactful. You can actually maybe preserve some resources. The second part is to recognize that the foundational research that informs Stretch shows what we would be an inverted U-shaped relationship between constraints and performance. And what I mean by that is constraints are good up until a certain amount of time. So you kind of imagine a U, you get to the top of the U where you have moderate constraints. Now, there's no percentage number that I can put on that, but from a conceptual level, you get to a point where additional constraints, like you just take this to its extreme, you're gonna have zero time, right? That becomes counterproductive to what you're doing. So we focus on moderate levels of constraints, and I recommend that you experiment with constraints. So you don't go from, let's just, cut time by 50%. Let's experiment and kind of see where the organization is at or where you're at personally, and then see if it's creating more generativity, new ideas, and innovation, and then you can try a little more. But you don't want to go from, one extreme to the other extreme.
I have a question. In your book, Joy at Work, you talk about, you've referenced a study about people using their cell phones.
Yeah.
And I want you to explain it. Could you talk about whether the phone is next to you, turned upside down, or further away from you, and how that impacts your work?
Yeah.
And then my follow-up is, when you work, can you give us, do you put your phone in the other room, or what tips such as that do you use that help you?
Yeah. So the study that she's talking about is looking at essentially academic performance and the relationship to where your smartphone is. And the idea was, you take some cognitive tests, so think of it almost like an ACT or an SAT type test, and there's different conditions of where the phone is. So in all conditions, the phone is, silenced. You can't see notifications no matter where it is. One condition is it's on your desk. Another condition is it's in a drawer, and a third is it's somewhere far away, like outside your office. And what the research concludes is that the more physically proximate the phone is, the worse your performance is on the test. Even in all three conditions, it's not beeping at you, it's not lighting up, it's basically just a block of plastic, either on your desk, in your drawer, or kind of away from your office. And the explanation for why this does this is the psychological knowledge of knowing that it's nearby and what you might be missing out on. And when you can look at it, even though it's not giving you any information, you are subconsciously thinking about the things that you're missing, and that's a cognitive distraction that makes you perform worse on your tests. So I taught an elective at the business school a few years ago where it's kind of organized like a book club, in part because I never had enough time to do my own book club, I felt. So I'm I'm going to be resourceful. I'm going to integrate this into my work, and I'm going to create a class around the book club where we read books. And one of the practices that a lot of the students were trying in that class was what it was like to kind of have their phones completely on the other side of their workspaces, and also try and not sleep with the phone next to their bedside, and it seemed to go really well for them. I tend to keep my phone in my backpack, so it's not out of my office. I don't know how practical that is, at least when I'm on campus, but I do try and keep it out of sight.
My name is John Morrow. Thank you for doing this. Two questions. One, I help company with turnarounds, and I've learned that one of the hardest things to help a company with is manage the emotions of the people you're there to help turn around. So when you're helping companies or doing your research, how do you handle that process? And so how do you manage the emotions of the people that you're there to provide organizational psychology to? My second question is I love your descriptions of stretch. How have you seen, or how do you anticipate the definition of the word stretch changing, adapting from one generation of workforce to another? Because there does seem to be a very different mindset between people my age and people half my age.
So on the first question about the emotions of change, I think largely leaders create a lot of the problems that they end up having to solve. And kind of the simple example I'll give you is kind of my introduction to some of the emotional consequences of organizational change done poorly. So we go back to my time in Silicon Valley at my high-flying startup, and this is how I learned about the first round of layoffs at that company. We're all in the office, thinking things are absolutely wonderful because that's what leadership is telling us. And the UPS driver shows up with a bunch of empty cardboard boxes and just drops them off at the reception. And given what was going on at the time, it didn't really take a lot of wisdom to be able to connect the dots. So you can imagine a lot of the emotions that provokes, like a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. And so these are things that could have been avoided, and we know from some of the research that companies, sometimes unfortunately do need to reduce their forces, but we know that companies that do this more virtuously have better financial performance. So there's a financial incentive to do this, but I think leaders still really struggle with this, largely because of their inability to manage their own emotions. The fear that they have about having difficult conversations and making difficult choices, they kind of defer things, keep employees in the dark about them, and then they get, employees get hit with this notification, and they feel like that trust was really broken. I mean, one day we're being told, we're doing great. The next day, a good chunk of employees, are getting laid off, and that violation of trust creates a lot of the negative emotions that leaders then feel like they need to solve. So I think if leaders got out of the way and kind of did their jobs better, a lot of these emotion challenges that you have would not be there. On your second question about generational differences between stretching, I don't know yet. What I do know is that the same type of socialization systems that basically take away our natural resourcefulness are still present, and in many cases are even stronger. So you think about the education system that we have, public education, for example. It's super rigid. It's essentially teaching people to the test, and so it's teaching that this is the way that you think. And it's taking away a lot of the creativity that people are naturally born with. And then you ask, well, what happens when they get to a job setting and they're only taught to think a certain way? So that might be a challenge in terms of whether or not people are able to kind of transcend the dominant culture and these institutions that seem to be so good at taking away our resourcefulness. But in terms of the implications, for example, of Gen Z on the workforce and resourcefulness, come back to me in 5 years. I might have something a little more substantive to say about it.
So I'd like to follow up that previous question a little bit. Back in the 90s, after the Soviet Union disappeared, there were congressmen boasting about not having passports and never having traveled overseas. And Congress decided it didn't need a lot of things, like the Foreign Service, which is what I was in. And so it wasn't that we were being fired, because you can't really fire a government employee, but they weren't hiring. So we had government hiring freeze. And my office was being, in this way, downsized, and my staff was very upset. And I took your book club idea, and I got copies of big bestseller at that time, which was Who Moved My Cheese?
Yeah.
And told my staff I wanted them to read it, and trying to encourage them to think about things have changed, and you need to think differently. The end result was that they all hated me. They thought that I was the one enforcing the change instead of people in Washington, D.C., over whom I had absolutely no control or influence. I don't know if you've come across that, and if you know a way to avoid the person who's having to make the change on the local level, get all of the animosity of the employees.
Yeah, I mean, the problem of kind of like, shooting the messenger, I think, is not just endemic to your experience, but it's a consequence in a lot of types of interactions where, I'm just kind of delivering the news. I'm not necessarily responsible for it. But I think you were just, the most visible person that they could see versus this abstract bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. that was making decisions. So my advice there would be, instead of focusing on the hand that you were dealt with, the stretchy answer would be, how do we kind of make the most out of this situation and find ways of taking the resources that we have, no matter what they are, and trying to come up with new practices that can help us fulfill our mission with what we have. And kind of focusing on the what can we do versus what don't we have, and that question maybe would make a difference.
This has been so fun, and your just way of exploring different situations and connecting business life and real life is reminding me of Malcolm Gladwell. Do you have thoughts of continuing to research different topics and being our local Malcolm Gladwell here, or are you just done for now?
No, I have a long, hopefully, career in front of me, so I'm just getting started. But it's funny you mentioned Malcolm Gladwell, because I have kind of a bone to pick with a little of his work, and there's one of the parts of Stretch we haven't really talked that much about is what I call the outsider effect, which is the idea that people who seemingly have the least expertise sometimes can unlock solutions to our most difficult problems. And Gladwell has this book called Outliers, where he talks about the 10,000 hour rule, which is based off of the psychological research of Anders Ericsson. And the outsider effect is basically meant to focus on our breadth of experiences versus our depth of experiences. Because a lot of the experiences that he talks about are very structured tasks. So, things that you can get really good at. So for example, in Ericsson's research, he studies people who memorize the digits of pi. So apparently people can go out like 500 or 600 digits, which, sounds like a really fun skill to have at a cocktail party, but I'm not really sure how practical that is. The type of work that most people do, the type of learning that most people do, are unstructured tasks. And with those unstructured tasks, what some of the research is beginning to show is that people who might not be experts in that area actually can have different ways of approaching those problems that can help unlock solutions that were previously not obtainable by so-called experts. So I think Gladwell is a great writer. That's that one part of his work that I don't agree with.
Sorry, so I'm going back to Who Moved My Cheese. I haven't read your book, but I did read that book, and believe me, I know what the effects of having my office read it were. It seems to me like it was an early version of what you're calling Stretch, because the point of it is saying, your cheese has been moved, you have to adapt. You're not going to get more resources, you're going to have to adapt. It didn't go down well at all. It just didn't go down.
Well, I wish you could get a do-over with a Stretch framework. Maybe the best you can do is try and think about what the counterfactual would have looked like.
exactly what I was trying to do. And I was telling them, you can't sit in your library. Now, you've been the library, having an American library in Jerusalem, and you've been the library director for 20 years, and that's all you want to do. There's no more library. So you need to rethink your job. What? You know, I can't. It's my job, and it's important. Everyone comes to me for information. You know, it's just, you started out, you hit one of my buttons when you started out by saying they'll do more with less, because Congress is always giving government workers less and then asking for more. And in our, specific things like the Human Rights Report, it started out one report, the political section underway, one report talking in general terms about the human rights situation in the country. Then somebody in Congress said, oh, we want a report on women's rights. Oh, we want another report on labor rights. Oh, we want another report on immigrants' rights in the country in which you serve. And by the way, we're cutting your staff. And you can't imagine your way out of it because Congress is demanding these things.
Right. And so, what you can do in that situation is to then think about, are there ways with the remaining staff that you have to continue to meet your objectives? And the idea from the stretch perspective is that those constraints, when you feel those constraints, will lead to differences in practices that you might not have been able to think of without those constraints. And so it's not about working harder and working into the ground because you're trying to do more with less. It's about how can you work differently and how do you get to those differences through these constraints. And the second part of that answer would be the problem, it sounded like, wasn't so much with the idea generation, it was how do you start the change process. Earlier today, I spent the first 6 hours of my day teaching an MBA class on change. And the advice I gave to my students today, I think is the same advice I would give you, which is nothing happens in change unless you establish urgency about the status quo first and convince people that the status quo is not tenable. It sounds like a lot of the people you're working with were not convinced yet that the status quo was untenable, and that's why they were not coming to terms with the fact that their cheese was being moved.
Thank you. Great questions tonight. I enjoyed listening to everybody. On behalf of the Association of Rice Alumni and Friends of Fondren Library, I'd like to thank Dr. Sonenshein and Mr. Castellanos for speaking with us today. And we will do so.
Oh, thank you.
Literally gift bags.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank all of you for being with us tonight. And we invite you to join us for a reception, and there's usually really good food at the Brown Fine Reading Library, which is just down the hall on this floor. And we hope to see you at other friends and alumni events. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the conference.
Again, I'll see you afterwards.